How do we change the stories we tell ourselves? Welcome to Tea at Taxevity, where you get insights from insiders, our many clients and friends. I'm Pramod Sharma, your actuary at Taxevity. I help people who care about sustainable financial independence harness the power of life and health insurance. Our guest today is author Christal Earle. Welcome, Christal.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks for coming here, because you're not in Canada very often, only half the time.
Yeah, I live half time between Toronto or somewhere when I'm out on the road in Canada and Dominican Republic, the north coast of Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm. And at the time we're recording, we had a really bad snowstorm, so I don't know why you picked this week.
I know. I was kind of wondering myself.
Yeah, and you've written this book, Resonate. Mm-hmm. And the first question I have is, how did you pick that as a title? I really like the word.
I know. I love the word. Well, when I first started collecting my thoughts around changing the stories that we tell ourselves and kind of sharing my own things and thinking back to how my journey has been, I came across a news story in 2011, and it was about a 39-story apartment or business building in Seoul, Korea. Mm-hmm. And what happened was, all of a sudden, at around like 11 in the morning, the building started swaying violently, and everybody in the building came running out onto the street thinking they were in an earthquake. And when they got out on the street, they realized there was nobody else out on the street. And what was happening was their building was swaying. And we've heard of that happening. You know, you hear of bridges suddenly having almost like they collapse. And what happened in this building was the resonant frequency in the building, because everything has a resonant frequency, was connecting up with what was happening on the 4th floor of this building at that exact time. And it was actually a step aerobics class. And they were this little group of people, I think it was only 18 people, and they were doing it to that "I Got the Power," that song. And and they were in the step aerobics class, and the frequency from them stepping their feet on this wood floor created something else in the building. And so that gave me the idea around how we create stories that we begin to tell ourselves and that we live our lives in light of, and it can happen based on something really small. It can almost seem like it's insignificant, but it connects up with a deeper message that we've already been believing, and we begin to live our lives in light of that story.
Because I hadn't thought about resonance expanding in that way. I was just thinking that you're in tune with something. But yes, when you think of those bridges swaying and breaking, that's quite powerful.
Yeah, it's very powerful. There's also resonance, you know, on a swing. When we're kids on the playground, and we learn one of the playground survival skills you learn when you're little is how to give a good push on the swing. And you learn very quickly that you don't push on the swing itself until it's right at the very apex of its swing, I guess you call it. And as you're moving with it, and you're creating greater resonance and movement by doing that. And so we're surrounded by resonance all the time, and what is happening in the natural around us is also happening inside of us.
Your book is about the stories we tell ourselves. Why do stories even matter?
Well, stories matter obviously culturally, because you know, they've been a part of how we've always communicated as humankind. But I think they matter because there is always, when we have an emotive response to a story, when it touches something inside of us that honestly, and it sounds cheesy, but actually resonates with something inside of us, we remember that. So maybe it's a good story, and you know, if you've ever watched you know, a good movie, that you remember the story, the moment, or the reverse is if, for example, trauma or bad experiences, we will relive those things because it's always evoking an emotional response to us, and we attach to those things. And so always when people, it's so much easier for us to numbers and facts and figures they're important, and they're the what we build everything on, but we can't connect with them in the same way, because we can't have an emotional connection to a number unless you're an extreme mathematician, I guess. But
well, I'm an actuary, so numbers speak to me.
Okay, well, there you go. Your stories are all around numbers.
No one wants to listen to the stories, though.
Oddly enough, eh? So, but I think that stories are powerful because they pull on the emotional depth inside of us.
We can tell ourselves good stories or we can tell ourselves bad stories. What sort of stories do you think we tend to tell ourselves?
Well, that's really interesting. I think that the path of least resistance is the, if we want to call them, like if we want to classify them as good or bad or helpful or hindering stories, maybe we'll call them. It's easy for us to connect with the stories that we're always looking to prove something true. So if we believe, for example, that if we have a belief inside of us that is like a niggling kind of thought that, well, I'm not good enough. Maybe, you know, I often use the example with people, think about it with public speaking. Well, if you believe that you're not good enough, the story that you're going to continue to prove true over and over in your life is you're going to navigate your life around not being good enough to get up on the stage, and you're going to tell yourself all the reasons, and you're going to make that story bigger and bigger. And there comes a point where you are going to have to, in order to, when we get to the point where we change that story, we're going to have to accept that this is what I believed. This may have even been the experience that caused me to take that belief. But from this point forward, I can create a new story around that. So the bad stories, the hindering stories, although they're powerful, the minute we begin to realize that they're not real, they're not the truth. Maybe they're real. That's maybe a better way to say is they're not the truth. We can then begin to generate and create new stories that become the good stories, that remind us of who we are and what's possible and what we can create in the world around us.
Are the stories we tell ourselves like affirmations?
Yes, I would say that, but I would say that the stories we tell ourselves are one step before. Affirmations for me are a part of my daily practice in my life.
Okay.
But I would say that the stories we tell ourselves are one step before that. Because in order for me to affirm something, I already have to, that has to be a part of a story, right? Like I affirm that I was born on January 1st, 1974, true story. And my poor mother, I was almost 10 pounds. I can affirm that story, but, and that I can create a positive affirmation around that. But without knowing and without believing the story, there's nothing to affirm, if that makes any sense.
Okay, because I was trying to understand the connection between the two. So the affirmation comes after the basic story is in place, it seems.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's not an all or nothing. I mean, I believe there are things all of our lives. It's like our life is a journey. That's the gift of life itself. It's a journey where it's like this gift we continue to get to open and unwrap and discover new things about ourselves. And the more that we do that, and the more that we invest in giving ourselves the gift of being able to learn about who we are and what we bring to the world, the more we realize the incredible potential that we have to make a difference in the world and to bring the best version of ourselves to the world.
Mm-hmm. You have a fascinating background, and I'm curious how that led to this book. How did you get started?
Well, originally, once upon a time, I was a youth worker in Saskatchewan, actually, which is where I'm originally from. I was a youth worker in a community, and I was helping, doing a lot of things in the local community. But one of the things that I was working with was in the local high school, helping them bring in motivational speakers and just different opportunities for the students to grow leadership abilities and get some inspiration. And what I noticed as a trend over the couple of years that I was doing that was that there was this plethora of people out there who were motivating. Meaning, if you work hard enough and you try hard enough and you don't do drugs and you don't do all the bad things, you can be just as good as me. And that's not exactly what they were saying. But there was nothing, there was nobody going into schools that was, at the time anyways, that was inspiring and calling to the deeper potential inside the students. And it wasn't about all the things you're doing wrong, like don't do drugs because they're bad for you. Well, guess what? They're probably, now that you've told me they're bad, I'm probably going to be much more curious, right?
Yes.
Instead, why not speak to the potential inside of them and help them connect with people who have experienced something and are at the same place in their life. And so that's how the whole charity that I started, co-founded with, it's called LiveDifferent. That's how we started everything, was realizing that if we could help students in the emerging generation begin to understand the power of their life and change the story that they were believing about their potential, then the rest of it is the small stuff, because they're now going to be so firmly held onto a belief that they're worth it in the first place. Of course we don't want them to do the bad things, but it's not because those things are bad, it's because you're worth more in the first place. And if you can believe and understand and tell yourself the story that you're worth more, then you're going to live your life in a totally different light.
Okay, and that's a story you tell yourself, and that was to high school students. When did you start your charity, and where is it?
We started in 2000. It's located in Hamilton. I now speak on behalf of the charity. I'm not as involved because now I'm writing and speaking, and I do coaching and involved in some social enterprise initiatives full time. But it's LiveDifferent is in about, probably does a few hundred shows a year in high schools, and I also do some speaking in universities. And then out of that came a humanitarian program, and we bring, I don't know, hundreds, if not close to 1,000 people a year to developing countries, and build schools and houses, and give students and adults the chance to experience the power of making a difference, but more than that, recognizing that they can partner with people in other circumstances to make a difference together.
It's really nice to meet people who are making the world better. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
How can we change the stories we tell ourselves?
You know, I have a friend, his name is Mark, and he, and I quote him in the book actually, because I first heard him say this. He said, "We look for what we want, but we find what we believe."
Wait a second, you have to say that again, because it sounds profound.
Yeah, it is pretty profound. A lot to chew on. We look for what we want.
Okay.
But we find what we believe.
Okay.
So, for example, to go back to the story of, let's just use public speaking. That's just an easy one to kind of pick on. I can say I'm looking for opportunities to get on a stage and to be this amazing public speaker. But if all I'm ever believing is that I'm going to mess it up when I get on the stage, or people aren't going to like me, I'm like, if I'm attached to all these stories and these ideas that I'm just going to keep on messing it up, I'm going to only ever find what I believe. And if I believe I'm going to work to believe it to be true, and I'm just going to keep on working to prove what I believe.
So we live up to our beliefs.
Totally, yeah.
Okay.
And that's not airy-fairy. That's just actually like everyday life. Like, we're doing it all the time, and it's neither good or bad. It just is a part of being. It's a part of being human. It's the gift of being human, right?
It's like when you're learning to drive, and you're always worried about that yellow line or that white line. If you keep looking at it, you're going to be on it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So to actually change the stories we tell ourselves, in the coaching model that I use, we have a term called you accept and create. Meaning, I can't change how that story got there. So, you know, for example, for me, truthfully, something happened on the playground when I was 10 years old that really, it resonated with a story that I was already believing, wondering if I was good enough, and something happened. It was a bullying incident, and I just began to live that out in terms of never believing that I was going to, that people were going to accept me, or that starting to think that I was somehow flawed.
Okay.
Because of what had happened.
Which is really sad for a 10-year-old.
And how it's sad for a 10-year-old, and how many people, if we were to really be honest with ourselves, we can trace back to moments when we're like, oh yeah. And it wasn't that moment was so evil, it was that it was already niggling at something inside, and it connected with that idea. And so but it's not like I can change that. I can't go back in time. I'm not Marty McFly, or I can't go back and change everything. And I can accept that it is what it is. And I can accept even the fact that, you know, that was what I was believing. But to change it doesn't mean I'm going back and I'm fixing everything, because I can't. You can't undo things. But I can generate something different from this step forward. So I begin to live my life in light of that. And one of the examples I use in the book is that when I was a kid, Santa, or my mom, would bring, I was a fashionista, and so my mom I'd get a lot of clothes for Christmas. And I remember getting this Orphan Annie polka dotted dress, and I loved that dress. And I was about a 6X when I got this dress. But the dress itself was a size 8 or 10, and so I remember putting it on, and it kind of looked like Orphan Annie in it, right? And so, and I remember thinking, oh no, and I knew that it was my dress, and it would hang in my closet, and so I identified with that being my dress, but I couldn't quite wear it because I could put it on, but it it wasn't fully comfortable yet. It was new, and I wasn't big enough yet to wear it. But it was there, and I knew I had the goal of getting into this dress. And I remember in grade 5, I was finally the right size, and I wore it to my Christmas concert. And I remember I just rocked that Orphan Annie dress at that Christmas concert, and feeling so good because I fit it. I owned this dress, and I really felt like this was my dress. And as silly as that sounds, that is actually kind of how we can liken that into moving into creating new beliefs around something. It can feel awkward at first to all of a sudden be able to, we might feel deciding that, I'm actually worthy of being loved. Let's just use that, for example. Mm-hmm. I'm worthy of being loved. Well, that almost can feel, at first we can feel guilty and think that the worthy cops are going to show up and we're going to get beat up for believing something so audacious. Mm-hmm. But we begin to lean into it, and we begin to live our lives in light of that. And every time that old story wants to rear its head and say, but remember when you didn't feel like this, you can be like, yes, you're right, I didn't feel like that. And now I'm choosing to feel like this. I'm choosing to tell myself this story. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. You've got an amazing story in your book about Kru Nam. Would you mind sharing that with us?
I would love to share Kru Nam's story. Kru Nam is a friend of mine. I'm very honored to call her my friend. She's a Thai woman, and I work with their children's home in northern Thailand in an area called the Golden Triangle, where Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos all meet. It's known for 2 things. It used to be known as the opium center of basically the world. But now it's known for one of the highest places of human trafficking, in particular women and small children. And through a series of events, Kru Nam she herself was a jewelry artist, and she had a very successful career. And she began to become aware of what was happening, and she actually changed her entire course in life and direction in life to begin to create ways to rescue these kids out of trafficking and to create a safe place for them, and to help them not just recover but find success in life. And in Thailand, the actual all of these children were stateless, and that is what had made them vulnerable to trafficking and slavery in the first place. They didn't have any identity papers. And the way that identities work in Thailand is if you can get those kids into school, and if they graduate from school, the Thai government will grant them legal status to be able to stay in the country and to be able to then become registered with all the social programs and everything. Mm-hmm. She knew that this was the only way to build these kids a sustainable future. And so when it came time, that first year, she had about 20 kids. And when it came time to, when school was opening up, she got all these kids, and these kids are all tribal kids. They're from hill tribes all over in the mountains and the outback. They don't look Thai. They're not. But she dressed them up in the school uniforms. She said she even cut their hair and did everything to make them look as Thai as possible. And she drove up to the first school, and she had all these kids, 20 kids, waiting in the back of this little pickup truck, waiting to be able to go into school. And she'd gone in and talked to the director, and she said she stood in the office of the director, and she explained the story, but she didn't tell him that they weren't Thai. And he was like, oh, okay, sure. So you have all these kids. And he was like, okay, well, and he starts walking out, and they're standing a ways off from the truck, and he realized, the kids peeked around, and he realized that they weren't Thai. And immediately he said, no, we won't have anything to do with it. And he walked away. And it was so powerful because Kru Nam actually shared this story on video, and I remember when we were shooting the video, she was crying because it was such a powerful moment for her. And she said that in that moment, I had a decision I was going to make about what I was going to believe in the story, that I was going to go back and tell myself and tell those kids. And she said those steps from where I stood, the walk between there and the truck was like the longest walk of my life. And she went back to the truck, and all these kids were like, can we go? Can we go? And she said she took a deep breath, and she said, I decided that I was going to, first of all, tell myself that, I wasn't going to vilify that man and make him evil. It wasn't about good versus evil. She said I was going, and even more than that, she said the story that I began to tell was going to be what was going to connect with these kids, and that they were going to believe about themselves. So she looked at them and she goes, you know what, kids? She said, today is not our day, but maybe tomorrow will be our day. And in that moment, she did something so powerful because she took the judgment off the situation, and she decided right then and there what story she was going to believe, and she recognized the power that her life held to help other people connect with that for themselves. And a few days later, she eventually found schools for all the kids, and they had to buy another vehicle because they had to be transporting these kids all over because no school would take all of them. But the point was is that in the beginning, when she started that whole organization and had these young lives, you know, she's had this responsibility, and she was holding the power of how she was going to mentor them and train them, and she chose this path. And you see it in those kids all the time. I mean, it's a place of freedom when you go to that children's home. They're not victims. They believe that there's so much potential for their lives, and they all have these hopes and dreams of what they can create in the future. And to me, that is so incredibly beautiful and profound, how we all hold that same power to affect history that way and to leave a legacy.
That's a very powerful story. Thanks very much for sharing that. What's your main message for the people watching today?
I think that one of the things, and I've said this in high schools for years, and all the time when I'm in conversation with people or when I'm out speaking, I always say that, you know, we can't control circumstances. Things happen. A lot of things happen out of our control. But the one thing we can control is we decide the story that we are going to tell ourselves. And I know that I keep saying that, but I cannot get away from it, because we are the only people that decide what we're going to believe about ourselves. And because of that, really, that means that we hold all this untapped power. And the more we invest in ourselves to recognize that we can change, not just change the stories, but we can continue to create beautiful stories and move forward from that point. It's like we just become the best version of ourselves, and the world wants us to become the best version of ourselves. That's why we're here.
What's the best way for people to reach you?
They can find me at yourbrillianceunlimited.com. They can also find the book at theresonatebook.com. And they can find me through Twitter at Christal Earle and Facebook, The Resonant Life.
Thanks very much for dropping by.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for Tea at Taxevity. The Taxevity Insurance Advisory helps you understand insurance and bridges gaps in your coverage. There's no premium for peace of mind. How healthy is your insurance?